Hi, everyone, and welcome to Protecht's next thought leadership webinar, where we're going to be talking all things risk and risk management and talking about a topic that's very close to myself and Michael's heart, and I should say Protecht's heart, and that is moving from risk management processes to focus on risk management outcomes. And it really gets to the heart of not just risk management, but anything we do in business. And that is, it's not always about the journey, it's about the destination. Maybe not in your personal life, the journey can be fun, but in business, really, it's about what are we trying to achieve from the processes we are following. We're not doing processes for process sake. And the whole purpose and the focus talking about outcomes is how do we make risk management an enabler? So in terms of, as we always do with these webinars, partners in crime, myself and Michael. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, it's a quick introduction. So my name is Michael Howell, the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protecht. The title sort of speaks for itself, but curious risk nerd by nature, and love feeding that into our products at Protecht, including our Protecht ERM software. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Michael. My name's David. I'm the Chief Research and Content Officer at Protecht and one of the co-founders. And again, my title speaks for itself, as both myself and Michael's passion is really understanding where risk management is going and to try and push Protecht's capability and the services we give to clients to the next level, particularly around value. To be a little bit more specific, we've been in business now for 26 years, and our focus is first and foremost, trying to create as much value for customers as possible through technology. We have our Protecht ERM system, which, yes, there's a lot of processes, but as you're going to see, they're very outcome focused. And we also support that through our Academy risk management training, online training, and also our advisory, which is our implementation and consulting capability. What makes us different? I think the main thing that we differentiate ourselves by is that we are an organization of ex-risk managers, or I like to think maybe current risk managers, and we have built product to support our customers. Rather than an IT firm or tech firm who's building risk software, we're kind of the other way around. What does that matter? Because what we deliver is really practical and very much outcome value focused. So in terms of the webinar, as always, a little bit of housekeeping. We'll go for about 60 minutes. As we go through, please pop your questions in the question box, and we will answer those as a blog post-course and send those to your post-webinar and send those to you. There will also be a post-webinar questionnaire that Michael will remind you of just as we finish the webinar. And as always, the slides and the recording will be made available and will be sent to you as a link when we get back to you.
Thanks, David. So I'd like to cover the key agenda items we're going to be covering today. And the first is why are we focusing on this topic? What is the perception problem that risk has or certain risk processes currently have? We'll focus on the outcome lens. What does it mean to take this outcome approach? We'll focus on some of the key risk processes, but really drive them with that purpose. Like, what is the purpose of those processes? What is the outcome that those processes should be delivering? Then we're going to focus on people. It's not just processes, but how do you get that buy-in and that engagement with all of your people around your risk process? How do you make them believe that it is in their best interest to follow some of these processes to deliver on those outcomes? And finally, we'll bring it all together with looking at some enterprise reporting and how you bring all those outcomes together. So starting with that perception problem, why do we even need this outcome focus in the first place? And I just want to focus on a couple of problems, perception problems that risk management has, maybe either broadly or perhaps as it's been implemented in perhaps some of your organizations. And the first problem is this compliance view of risk. And there are some that believe that risk is just something that we have to do, and it's viewed as this compliance obligation. And for some of you, that is true, especially in financial services and certain sectors. There is an obligation or a compliance obligation to do risk management, but that's not the purpose of risk management. But if it is viewed through that lens, then you're potentially missing out on some of the true value that you can get out of risk management and the processes that should be delivering those outcomes. Similarly viewed as just something we have to do, people just see it as a process that is thrust upon them perhaps. And Most importantly, there's no link to objectives. If there is a purely compliance view, this is just an activity that we have to do. It may not be linking directly to objectives of the organization. And not just objectives of the organization, but the people that you are expecting to do or perform some of these risk processes. So David, in terms of this particular problem, have you seen this come up in training? I know you work with some of our customers on implementation or helping them through that process. How often does this sort of problem come up, and any other tips or thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, the first time we often engage with the customer, particularly around training or doing a workshop, it is very common. And you know that it's there because people walk in to a workshop, a training course, with their shoulders drooped, kind of looking at their phones, going, how long have I got to be in this risk management training course? And it feels just such a burden of what they have to do. Now, fortunately, or at the end of the sessions, at the end of the workshops, the end of the training, often they'll be kind of asking for more. What's the difference? We're going to talk about it more. It truly is changing the whole approach to risk management from this, we have to do it, to we want to do it. And you do that through motivation, incentive, and focusing on outcomes. So it's a very common thing, Michael.
Thanks. So problem number 2 can be this perception of being a handbrake. That risk or risk teams and the processes that are part of that risk management framework are there as a handbrake. We say this often, David, or we hear this often, that people think about this department of no, business prevention unit, many other phrases like this, where the risk team is perceived as someone who is there to stop the business from doing something that they want to do, from potentially even pursuing their objectives. Also potentially perceived as looking for problems. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in some of the engagement pieces, but line one or frontline managers who should be responsible for risk management, if they're not engaged in that process and they perceive that the risk management team is the people who are managing risk, because that's in their title and that's their job, then they might throw those problems over the fence and then assume that those people are just telling them, well, no, they can't do that. And they're those stoppers in the organization. So problem number 3 is inefficiencies. And a couple of surveys that we've seen have highlighted that they have these inefficiencies due to insufficient use of technology. So I think this was from PwC, and I think it's 62% of survey respondents weren't maximizing their use of technology to manage their risk. So that's them using the risk, but also as a separate a survey also showed that many of those respondents believe they could get more value from a better alignment between processes, domains, and technology. And particularly around that alignment piece, bringing all of those things together, and not just in terms of efficiency, but that efficiency can also help drive effectiveness. If people are more engaged with the process because it is more efficient, then they can focus more on those value-added activities. And that can be very difficult to achieve through fairly manual processes like spreadsheets or Word documents or technology that's just not integrated as a whole. So we've got these 3 problems. Does that mean we should be dumping risk processes altogether? Well, I think you already know the answer is, of course not. We've seen some very high-profile business failures. Silicon Valley Bank, FTX. I'm sure there are many others that we could cite where risk management either didn't exist, wasn't done well, or perhaps all the way on the other side was done extremely poorly. So risk processes have value, or they should have value. If they're not in your organization, focus on transforming them. Focus on what the outcome is intended to do. What is that process intended to achieve for the organization, rather than dumping out the baby with the bathwater. Focus on what stakeholders want. So particularly if you've maybe adopted a risk framework and thrust it upon people in the front line without really engaging them in that process, then they're not really going to be engaged. They're not going to, or they might not have an understanding of what that process is there to do. And if you engage with them in understanding what they want, what they can get out of that process, then you're going to get much better engagement. And finally, aiming for that balance. So yes, you need risk processes, but you don't want to make them burdensome. You want to make them outcome focused, but have enough structure in place that you can then enable reporting, insights, and more. So, David, I'm going to hand over to you in a second to talk more about that outcome focus, like what that means. Any further comments from you before we do on, any of these perception problems and what we should do moving forward?
Look, I think the big one while you were talking for me is, go back to the destination in terms of travel. We always want to get to the holiday destination or wherever we're going. And until they work out the Star Trek Beam Me Up Scotty machine, probably not long away, actually, we've got to go through the process. We've got to get up in the morning, go to the airport, get on the plane, fly there, get a taxi the other end or an Uber, and get to our destination. So you can't have good outcomes without process. The difference is the process needs to be aimed on good outcomes, not going on that process for the sake of doing it. I think that's the key. So now what we're going to move to is looking at the risk management, compliance management through an outcome lens, which is really saying, well, yes, we need to have these processes, but unless they are completely linked to and focused on the management of uncertainty on the outcomes, we are not going to provide value through our risk management. And it goes all the way back to the definition of risk in our ISO 31000 standard. As we all know, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, the focal point, therefore, in everything we do in risk should be objectives, and it's written into that definition. If we go a little bit further and think about what does that actually mean, the standard goes on to say that that effect is a deviation from the expected outcome, or in my analogy, the destination. Did you want to go to Brighton in the UK and did you end up at Brighton in the US? That has happened to some unfortunate travellers I know. So this is all about a deviation from the expected outcome. It's very important to appreciate it can be both positive, often expressed as opportunities, and negative, yes, we know that one, expressed as threats or both. So straight away, this focus on the uncertainty around achievement of our objective is key. Now, as a result, we end up with then two sides to risk. We've got now the upside, the opportunity side, and the threat side. And that gives rise to two types of risk. The first type of risk is a one-sided risk. And that one-sided risk is where there is only downside. And we have typically WHS injuring your staff. There's no direct upside, there's threat only. And our focus should be to reduce that risk as low as reasonably practicable. Why? Aimed at the outcome of safety for our employees and other interested parties. However, there are some risks that have two sides, where both a threat and an opportunity. The most obvious one, especially in the current environment, is technology strategic risk, where we've got to decide on what strategy are we going to follow for our technology digitization. We've now got the concept of how much AI do we put into our product and how much AI do we put into your technology in your business right now. Now, there is a big risk if you go too early. The risk is, yes, it could go horribly wrong with all the risks we have in AI, but equally it could go right. And you could now push yourself and advance yourself much further than you thought possible by getting in early. That is opportunity risk. Now, in that instance, both of those focuses are linked to the outcomes, our objectives of that digitization strategy. If we think about then our focus of outcomes, we typically call these objectives, whatever you wish to call them, vision, outcomes, but most organizations consider them in two parts. Firstly is change the organization outcomes or objectives, and we typically call these strategic objectives. These are focused at changing the ongoing operating model of the business, and usually these are supported by one or more major strategic projects. Typically, this comes from your strategic plan, and typically that is divided into strategic themes, and then you're going to have multiple objectives under, say, the marketing stream, the product stream, and these are our focus in terms of strategic change the organization. Now, risk management needs to be focused heavily on making sure those strategic objectives are achieved, and this brings us to strategic risk, both strategic decision and execution risk. Secondly, we then have our business as usual objectives, and our business as usual objectives are really focused on what are we trying to achieve coming to work every day, keeping the operating model the same as it is at the moment. And this 9 objectives are very common objectives for most organizations. Some you will all have, others you may only choose based on the type of organization you are, including the S&E in ESG, social and environmental impacts. Now, what's interesting is a lot of clients we work with, when we do risk management and we ask them for their operational and strategic objectives, let's just say what comes from them is less than perfect. They are very vague. A lot of them don't actually know and have not stated their operational objectives. So anything to do with moving from process to outcome-focused risk management must start with a really well articulated set of operational and strategic objectives, which above all else must be able to be measured. Now, once we've got now our operational objectives, we bring that together at Protecht in terms of what we call the pyramid, and it really does highlight at the highest level, board level, at framework level, how our risk management links with outcomes to move us away from process to outcome. Now, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. As we've spoken about, we should always then pin everything we do to understanding our vision, our operational and strategic objectives, and this is our outcomes. And this webinar is all about making sure our risk management is aimed firmly at the top of that pyramid. Now, as we've spoken about, this is the destination. Right? What is the process? What is the journey we have to go on to achieve this? Well, operational objectives need an operating model. These are our critical processes, inputs, outputs. Strategic objectives need our strategic projects. And this layer here is our critical processes, critical projects. Now, what's important is that when we deliver a project into the business, it will deliver specific changes to the operating model. And that is the journey, that is the train trip on the way to your destination. Now, sitting under that, we then have the risks that could impact upon the operating model and the projects. Firstly, operational and financial risk, strategic and project risk. And these risks are our risk layer, and these are the things that cause uncertainty on the achievement of the processes and projects, which filter through to the achievement of our objectives. This pyramid needs a foundation. What is the foundation? Yes, risk management, operational and financial risk management, strategic and project risk management, and in the middle, risk in change or change delivered risk, which is really making sure that when we deliver a project into the business, we have thought all about the operational and financial risks that we are going to affect, and we are going to change ahead of time, the no surprises risk management. Now, that then becomes the foundation of everything we do. So today we're talking about risk management, but making sure that bottom foundation layer is not just a set of detached processes, that these processes are linked firmly to the top of the pyramid, the outcomes, the vision. Now, here we've got a lot of linkages, and the importance in your risk management that you have strong linkages between all of the elements of risk, the elements of outcomes, the elements of process, and the elements of risk management. Now, at Protecht, we love to tie all of these bits together using risk bow tie analysis. Real brief comment on this for those of you that have not used risk bow tie analysis. We have an awful lot of information on our website under the Knowledge Center, and we also have a training course on our Academy platform for risk bow tie analysis. Now, risk bow tie analysis has in its center the main risk event. This is where we lose control of the situation, and from there we go to the left by asking, but why? And we go back to the root causes of what could cause that loss of control, that loss of influence in the middle of the main risk event. And that is what we call the left-hand side, driver's side of the bow tie. Now, at this stage, we understand why the risk event has occurred. However, that does not show that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So now we need to travel to the end of this risk event, what happens next, and we do that by going right, and this then takes us through now our various interim events, including failure of critical processes, and then our impacts. From those impacts, we then go and add our controls, preventative controls on the left, detective controls in the middle, and corrective controls on the right. So where on earth are outcomes? Outcomes are directly linked to our impacts. And that is then a complete picture from the root cause of a risk all the way through its elements to impacting on objectives. Now, diagrammatically, that is the best way to illustrate risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, in addition, we are talking about risk and compliance management. Where does compliance sit? We should have our regulatory obligations that we understand, and they will link to one or both of these. Number one, the objective number two, we're going to assume is to comply with relevant regulatory obligations. So by failing to comply, we have got an impact on that objective, and we can link that to our specific regulatory obligation. In addition, in this example, we're assuming that the regulatory obligation is a minimum control standard for this risk. So it also links directly to the control. An example would be wearing your seatbelt when you drive a motor vehicle. Yes, it has an impact in terms of the risk, but it also is a need to comply with road rules. Now, this is the ideal scenario of linkages when you are doing outcome risk management. When you're doing process-based risk management, Michael, what does that look like? Not so good.
I think something we see is this disjointed approach where we stop at the main risk event. So we may not even go backwards to the causes either, where we may have a risk register that just has a list of risk events, no linkage to objectives, maybe an impact category might be selected, but there's not that direct linkage to those outcomes. And just as you were talking then, thinking about this, the impacts on the right side of our bow tie and then linking it directly to objectives. I know that we've had lots of discussions where you've done lots of workshops with people where they have a risk appetite statement or they've got their objectives and the impact categories in their risk, risk framework or risk appetite statement don't match. So even if they do have an impact category, it may still not directly link to some of those objectives. And once we do start bringing a lot of those linkages together that David's talked about, both in the risk and reward framework and the risk bow tie, many of these are many-to-many relationships. You may have a cause that has an effect on multiple risks or a risk that has an impact on multiple objectives. And there can be challenges in maintaining a lot of these linkages with manual processes. So I guess that some of those processes, by being manual, fail then to focus on those outcomes or deliver adequately on all of those outcomes. So let's move then to understanding some of those processes and moving some of those processes to be more purposeful. And highlighted before, and just reiterating one of these messages from this one's from KPMG, is that 71% of CROs, risk managers, were looking for that integration, and that integration leading to better decision making. So not just more efficient risk processes, but actually improving risk outcomes, which is the key focus of our webinar today. So David, I think what we'll do now is walk through some of the key risk processes and maybe look at some of the potential problems and potential fixes. But do you want to give us a bit of a highlight of the some of those key risk processes before we dive in a little bit deeper?
Certainly. So we'll go and play darts on our dartboard, and the bullseye, which is the center of everything we do, no surprises. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. There it is, right in the center. And I think what's really important here is from an operational point of view, we often see objectives being managed by finance, managed by a strategy department. And then we have risk management on a completely different floor in the building, and they never talk to each other, and they manage their risks in a separate way, not dissimilar to what Michael explained in the risk bow tie. Now, this is not smart because we are just going to end up with process around risk. We're not going to end up with outcomes. So we've got to have our objectives in the middle. We've got to have strong communication with our strategy and our finance and our reporting teams. We've got to have a good visibility and input into our strategic and business plans. And this is always the start. We go out one ring. We've then got our risks and control taxonomies. What are the risks and related controls that link to those objectives? We then go through our very common processes, which as long as they are linked to those objectives, we're going to have outcome risk management, risk and control assessment, controls assurance, risk metrics, incident management, issues and actions management, compliance, and change risk management or risk in change. Now, there's our core kind of activities. That's the plane, trains, and automobiles to take you on the journey to get to your objectives island. And from there, we then get the specialist risk cases, which amalgamate a number of these techniques together, such as ISMS, where you will have controls assurance, risk control assessment, third-party risk management, WHS, and so on. From there, we shoot out to the outer layer, the tire. And this is where we're now going to get our outputs, our escalations, and our reporting, which Michael's going to take you through in some great detail a little bit later to have a look at what outcome-focused reporting really looks like. So that's really the frame up of how it kind of fits. And Michael, I know you're now going to go into some of these in a little bit more detail to take a look at how outcomes filter through to this.
Absolutely. So I'll focus first on some of the problems that we see around, I guess, being more process focused. And so if we start with risk and control self-assessments, as David mentioned earlier, this lack of link to objectives can be one of the biggest downfalls of risk and control self-assessments. One of the first things that I would usually do in a risk workshop is plaster objectives all over the wall. So whether it's for a business unit or something within a specific scope, is understanding the objectives ahead of time, ideally, and plastering them right in front of all of the stakeholders who are running or, attending that risk workshop. And if they don't exist or people aren't aware of them, well, that's the first thing that we talk about because there is that lack of link to objectives. People are not going to be engaged if it is just what are all some bad things that could potentially happen that are disconnected. Siloed approach we see sometimes with not just individual business units, but one thing we're seeing a bit more of now is thinking about processes end to end. And there are a lot of things occur across an organization, not just within individual business units. There's handovers of process, data that is crosses borders. So the siloed approach can sometimes miss some of those handovers or miss risks that might occur across an end-to-end process that aren't evident within a single business unit. Set and forget. I think we've all seen this where people will do this, especially with a compliance view. If it's something you just think you have to do and it's once every 12 months, we get the risk register out, we blow off the dust and just have to do one every 12 months. Then it goes back in a drawer. No one looks at it. It's not linked to outcomes. That's a common problem that we see because people don't perceive that value benefit. And linked to that siloed approach is that there's that lack of aggregation. So even if individual business units are doing an effective workshop in and of itself, there may not be that holistic view across the organization of the same type of risk occurring in multiple places. So in terms of some of the potential fixes, is taking that objective-centric approach, ensuring that risks that you document in your organization have this direct linkage to an objective. We are seeing more focus in risk and control self-assessments, not just at a vertical business unit perspective, but also an end-to-end horizontal perspective, and considering an end-to-end process or value chain, especially those that are serving customers, and considering the risks across the whole end-to-end value chain. And finally, using taxonomies to aggregate. This allows not just looking at that individual business unit, but then how does the outputs of those risk and control self-assessments, how do they get escalated up to executive, board, or other stakeholders so that they can make informed decisions about risk across the whole organization? So based on these, David, any other problems that you've experienced in any workshops that you've done or any training that you've delivered?
Yeah, look, when you were talking, it just reminded me a number of years ago now, just really briefly, I was asked to do a risk control workshop in a major client of ours. And I said, why haven't you got a team that does it? And they said, yes, we did it last year. And the head of ICT for what the workshop was on ICT, they said he came in and within about 7 minutes, he'd put his laptop together, walked out and gone, this is a waste of time. I've got better things to do. I thought this is going to be fun. Anyway, I went into the workshop and sure enough, he came in about 5 minutes late, phone under the table. And I simply asked, what are your objectives of ICT? And he kind of looked at me and go, why are you asking me that? This is a risk workshop. I said, just go with me. So anyway, we started to talk about the objectives and so on. He started to become more engaged. And after about 20 minutes, he said, this is actually more interesting than our strategy day that we had yesterday. We're, getting more things out of it. We had 3 hours for that workshop. After about an hour and a half, we hadn't even spoken about risk. We were talking about outcomes. And after 3 hours, he said to everybody, has anybody got anything to do for lunch? I'll buy you lunch. We'll stay for another hour. Now, that had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with the approach of being outcome-centric. And as Michael's going to talk about later, the engagement you get from being outcome-focused is phenomenal. So there is a massive difference between a great RCSA and a very poor one, and most of it has to do where you start. Thanks, Michael.
So in relation to that end-to-end process, what we've got shown here is our operations in motion. So not just at a business unit level, but looking at individual operations and focusing on outcomes. If I look at this particular dashboard, the thing that stands out to me is, we've said this process, availability of mobile banking services is strong, it's resilient. But when I look at the data, I see that we've got 6 controls that are connected. So 6 key controls that have been connected, but none of them have been reviewed in the last 12 months. And we had a couple of incidents. So if I was looking at this dashboard, the question that really comes out for me is, what is management doing about that? Is that actually strong? So this is where we bring together all of that information to be really focused on those outcomes. How can we deliver this process and make sure that it is resilient and call out the things that might mean it isn't? So moving on from our CSAs, this is, if we think about bow ties, these are bow ties waiting to happen. We then move into risk metrics, which we consider bow ties in motion. Risk bow ties or risks flow from that beginning of the life cycle of risk to the end, from causes through to those impacts. So risk metrics or key risk indicators can give off those puffs of smoke to identify potential risks that are evolving. So I want to highlight a few problems that we see and then some of the fixes. So sometimes people just have no idea why they're being collected. They might be asked to start reporting on a particular metric, but they have no idea why they're reporting it. No one could be looking at those metrics. It might be that someone has set up the process some time ago. Maybe there isn't someone who is reviewing it on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're effective or that they are even used in decision-making at all. And especially if they're pushed down to people on the front line and they might have no idea that they're not being used. They might just assume that someone somewhere in their ivory tower is looking at some of these metrics. We see thresholds that sometimes don't make sense, threshold breaches not being actioned. Personal story is I've used metrics for employee turnover. We set up some metrics, and then for the next 6 months, that metric was out of tolerance. But they need to be actioned. No one was taking any action. It was kind of just, that's okay. But the problem with that is then it becomes a cultural problem where stuff in red or outside of tolerance becomes the norm, and then no one feels like they should be speaking up about some of those things. We also see collecting what's easy, maybe systems or processes easily deliver some form of data, but maybe it's not taking that top-down objective-first approach and identifying the metrics that are most aligned with that objective. And of course, the manual collection and follow-up, especially if there is a manual process. I spoke to someone recently where they spent a few hours every month just pulling together a few metrics through manual processes, which were easy to automate. So in terms of the key fixes, engage the frontline in development of those metrics. Then you get the buy-in. They understand why the metrics being collected, and they might even have good ideas about how the metrics should be measured, rather than someone else choosing it for them. Be transparent on their purpose, how is it being used, what risks is it linked to, especially if the people using those metrics don't see the full enterprise risk management framework. Ensure that they drive action. As I mentioned before, if things are constantly out of tolerance and no one's taking action, then it bleeds into that poor culture problems. Dynamically adjust the metrics and thresholds, so don't just set them once and assume that they remain forever the same. Businesses change. With AI in particular at the moment, we're finding people who might have had low tolerance before are realizing that they need to have more tolerance for AI risks in order to embrace some of the potential rewards. And in my example, we looked at the employee turnover rates after that 6 months and went, actually, you know what? This is kind of the norm for the industry. It's actually not too far from it. Maybe we actually need to raise those thresholds because we were being unrealistic in the first place. Focus on leading indicators. As I mentioned through the bow tie life cycle, if you can focus more on the leading indicators, those leading indicators are indicators of future non-performance. So risk metrics we usually make up of key performance indicators, key risk indicators, and key control indicators. And the more leading they are, the more you can predict or act on potential non-performance, as opposed to KPIs, which are all about performance, or if they're not being met, non-performance. And finally, automate that data collection and reporting. Once you've decided on those metrics, set up a process that enables automation, issuing straight to individuals who need to report on that, maybe even through APIs and collecting that data, and then being able to report it immediately so it can be actioned. Any thoughts from you on risk metrics, David, before we move on?
I was just going to continue my analogy, to be honest, and think about, I don't know, going to a concert, and you're going to go by a car, and you've got to be there by 8, and it's very important you get there by 8 and have a wonderful time. Now, your objective is to have a lot of fun, have a wonderful time, and critical success factors, get there by 8 o'clock, all those things. Now, if you go backwards, as you said, Michael, from your objective and work backwards and start thinking about the things that could go wrong, and then how could you put indicators around those? Now, if I think about then driving, be able to get some statistics around volume of traffic between your home and the venue would be one of many. Inclement weather, storms coming, all those kind of things. Now, if you could make sure you collected those and you got them early enough, leading indicators, you could then make a decision. Maybe you're going to go by train. And now you've got a much better outcome. Now, what you're doing is prompting with indicators to make a decision, a different decision, which decision making is so important from an outcome perspective. And also, very importantly, each of those risk indicators like weather, volume of traffic is linked directly to that outcome. And it just really highlight that people talk about what's the difference between a KRI and a KPI. A KPI is how much fun did we have at the concert, right? And a KRI is measuring all of those risks that could impact on that fun. And if we can measure them early, we can change tack and go by train to ensure that our outcome is better than it could be if those risks were manifest. Over to you.
Thanks, David. And just noticing here on this particular dashboard, as an example, as you were talking through that, is, we've got nearly all sort of red and yellow metrics in this last month, which sort of indicates we're really pushing the boundaries of, the risks that we're taking. And if I look a little bit closer at the bottom one there, training absentee rate, well, it's been escalating for 4 months in a row. Now, it's not out of tolerance yet, raised attention, but I'd be acting on that now to find out why is there this increasing absentee rate? Is it something we should be addressing before it comes out of that tolerance? And I think it's similar to employee net promoter score, or satisfaction scores, both estimates. So maybe there's a potential common cause there or a correlation that this would cause me to investigate. So moving on to incident management. So these are now incidents that have happened, risk bow ties that have occurred. And one of the problems that we see is this symptom management. This can be perhaps providing compensation to customers or resolving the outcomes of the issue, but not really going back to the root cause. So I just said they're kind of bow ties that have happened, but sometimes people don't even map the bow tie. They just have that impact, and that's what they capture, but they don't really go back to those root causes. This can be exacerbated by blame cultures, where incident management is all about finding the person who may have caused this incident to occur, without focusing on that improvement culture. They may not be linked to the risk profile. Incident management might be considered a completely separate process that then doesn't enable that aggregated view that we'll cover a bit later. No trend analysis, especially if you don't do root cause analysis. I think that's the main trends that I would want to be seeing is, are there common root causes across multiple incidents, perhaps different types of incidents, but they may have some common root causes. Near misses might be completely ignored. I find that near misses are great opportunities for learning. They are incidents that didn't quite happen, but can be used to prevent future incidents from happening. And finally, we see limited scope, meaning we only focus, or some organizations might only focus on incidents that they're regulatory required to have a formal process for. Or maybe there's just, IT incidents as an example, without considering all of those. So it is focusing again on that compliance view of, well, we need to do this, rather than how can we improve our business and overall our long-term outcomes, especially if they're customer-facing type incidents, over a longer period of time. So in terms of some of the fixes that you can consider, develop that culture of improvement. So incidents are not a place to look for blame. Therefore, how can we improve our processes in the organization as a whole? Don't waste your near misses. Try and capture those so that way that you can learn from them. Make sure that your people are able to speak up, and then also track data to identify trends across the organization. And if I look here at this particular dashboard, process failure, if I look at the root cause in that sort of bottom middle panel, process failure seems to be the most common root cause. Now, it might not just be processes or failures within an individual process. Maybe there is a more systemic failure around the way we document our processes at an organizational level. The other thing that stands out to me when I looked at this earlier is we've got lots of incidents that happen on a Monday. Now, I'd be asking, why are they happening on a Monday? Are there system issues that keep glitching on a Monday morning? Do we have lots of leave? Do people just not want to come in after the weekend? What is that potential driver that means we've got all these incidents happening at the same time? And again, if you're not tracking either near misses, or you're not tracking or identifying some of these root causes, then you won't know this information in order to be able to act on it and improve on those particular outcomes. So we then come to controls assurance. Now, David, I know this one's close to your heart, is that one of the biggest problems we see with controls is that people don't actually know the objective of the control. They don't define how the control is meant to modify the risk. They just know that it's a process they have to do. They might not even know that it is a control. So they just do it blindly. It's more of a compliance exercise. I've seen this happen a few times where people know that a control is broken and they focus on what's already known, and they follow a controls assurance process and go, well, we should do a formal assessment of that control. But if management already know that the control is broken, there's no point doing that controls assurance. You're going to just tell them something they already know. So that is process for process sake, rather than really focusing on the outcome. Compliance-centric focusing on whether the control exists for a compliance purpose rather than managing your risks, and being cyclical. So not really focusing on how important is this particular control, but doing controls assurance on a regular, quarterly, 6-monthly, annual basis, whatever it may be, without really considering how important is this control to the objectives of the organization. So some of those key fixes is getting that linkage correct. So making sure that you link your controls to the risks and to the objectives that those risks relate to. That way you get that flow-through effect of understanding which controls have the most effect on achieving your objectives. Embedding that mindset that assurance equals opportunity. What does that mean? If you provide that level of assurance to key stakeholders, it means that they have more confidence that they can push a little bit harder. Maybe there's new opportunities that they can pursue further in the organization, take on new objectives. And of course, test the controls based on their real importance, which means you need to be able to track that effectively. In terms of this dashboard and how I would use this to focus on outcomes is, if we look at that top left dashboard or top left panel, I can see that the design rating on a couple of those controls is ineffective. And one thing that we do at Protecht is we like to filter through data to find new insights. So if I filter this dashboard by only looking at those controls that have ineffective design, I can start seeing that, well, all of those are manual, which might be an indicator that manual controls are more likely to be ineffective. So it allows us now to look for a focal point to improve those outcomes and get better assurance. Is perhaps we need to be focusing on automating a few more of our controls. Now to those processes that we've covered so far, all of those and some other processes in the organization can give rise to issues and then actions that you need to pursue in order to address those issues. I think the biggest problem that we see here is that issues can be identified and someone fires off an email because they've identified something, and then those emails just disappear. There's no tracking. They die in inboxes, essentially. They're somewhat related is lack of accountability. And I don't mean individuals that lack accountability, but just that there's not an accountability for the whole process, meaning that everyone's very busy. They have lots of things that they need to do, lots of objectives that they need to pursue. And maybe some of these issues fall by the wayside because they're so busy doing all these other things. They're, I need to focus on these other things that I'm being pressured to do or I've got deadlines for. And because there might be that lack of accountability across perhaps an executive team or leadership team, they kind of just let them fall by the wayside and they'll wait until someone follows up, which might not happen if there isn't that collective process. Related to that is this multiple processes can confuse users or people in your organization, which means you might have an incident management process for many different types of risk rather than having a single centralized process. Game playing, David, I know this one's you're something that you enjoy or something that we've bantered about. Do you want to provide?
You've got to be careful what you say there. You said I enjoy gameplay. I'm sure it was a Freudian slip, Michael.
Yeah.
But look, a big one here is we always say you get what you measure. So if you want everything green, you'll get it green. Particularly around issues and actions management, very common things we see is where we see due by dates for actions to be implemented continually pushed out. We say in order to overcome an overdue action, you close the old action and open a new one with a new date, and so on and so forth. Now, unfortunately, that does reflect kind of poor culture, but you've got to be able to make sure that you build your dashboards and your information to pick that up and to avoid that, and obviously spend a lot of time on training your staff on better risk culture. But just be careful of game playing when we talk about this, because that is going to go totally against better outcomes because they're playing the game, not actually improving outcomes.
As you're talking there, David, I remember regulatory prudential review of one of the banks in Australia, and I'm sure it was 6 years that one of their actions had been continued to be pushed out. The DGA kept changing every single time it came up. We would just keep pushing it out. And it was 6 years when the regulator reviewed it. So incredible amount of game playing. So what are the fixes? Have some coordinated processes, not just incident management in individual business units or for individual types of risk or types of incidents. Try and coordinate them as much as possible. Have that single source of truth. So all issues and actions are all in the one location. Then very easy to identify potential duplication or where resources need to be allocated across the organization, again, in order to improve those outcomes. And related to that is this clear ownership and visibility. If people can see all of the actions across the organization, then when there is a need to reprioritize, then it can be done in that broader context, not in that isolated, siloed view.
So, Michael, my favorite topic, and you think I'm strange because compliance to me is one of the most important things we ever do in an organization, and people often disagree. So I just want to share the thoughts of moving compliance from process to outcomes. And I often do this in compliance training. And I'll ask the question, and if we take anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing obligations as an example, ask a junior compliance officer, what is the objective in you managing these obligations? And commonly they will say to ensure that our organization complies. Very short-sighted. Push them a bit further and they will go to ensure the organization doesn't get damaged reputation and brand, doesn't suffer financial loss due to fines, and doesn't get bad regulatory pressure, hard regulatory action on them. And again, I say go a bit further because you're not right at the outcome yet. Fundamentally, you go to why do we have the obligations in the first place? AML-CTF is to stop terrorists killing innocent people. It is to stop drug lords poisoning our children or ourselves. And that is the ultimate outcome. of what compliance is all about. It's amazing the amount of times you say that, and compliance officers who are a little bit kind of, reserved and shy, suddenly they grow in stature. And this is so important when you move to outcomes, risk and compliance management, is that the value of what the organization or the people in the organization delivers is seen in a completely different light. And I would leave you with this thought: is there anybody in an organization more important than stopping terrorists killing innocent people? And I would argue no. Hence, once you take an outcome view of compliance, they become the most important department. So coming back to you, Michael, why did I get this attestation is a common issue. How would you now answer?
I think it is that, like, how do we link this back to the outcome? What outcome does this link to? And again, linking back to one of the things we said earlier, which is engaging people in the process, is not just giving them a question, but giving them an opportunity to say, okay, great, you're asking me to answer this question as to whether we're compliant or whether I've done this particular task. How does it help the organization understand how it's achieving its objectives? I think that is certainly one of the keys. Related to that is this perverse incentives, and I've definitely seen this at play. And when I implemented attestations as part of a compliance management process, is that I really empowered people to say no, that there is a power in saying no. No meant that we knew what to focus on. Why could we not, or why could this individual not complete this task? Why could this individual not ensure that we were compliant? If there is a focus on, this person didn't do the right job, and it's either a individual KPI, or especially if it's linked to remuneration, I think that can be very a perverse focus, which means they're going to hide it and focus on trying to get a yes answer or a green answer, or however you want to frame it, as opposed to, I need to make the organization aware that we're not compliant here, or that we're not achieving this particular goal. So that to me is one of the keys around compliance culture. Similar things that we've said before about some of the other processes. No one reviews the results. There's no trend analysis that's completed, so we don't know what, if there's a trend of non-compliance. We just perhaps deal with them on a one-time basis each time that they occur. So some of the fixes is defining the compliance objectives, embracing a speak-up culture, and also tracking those trends. And I can see from this dashboard that we've got revoking access. Hasn't been done 4 times in quick succession. So we should be finding out from HR or people and culture, why is that a problem? Why can't we turn off that access? Is there something that's preventing that from being done at the right time? So our final process I want to touch on is risk in change. And just to frame up quickly, risk in change, this is the delivered risk that David talked about before, is that we may have a current risk profile. Risk in change is about how is that going to change in the future? But we might have a forecast risk profile where some risks shift, some risks might be introduced, and some risks might be eliminated altogether. Now, some of the problems that we see is simply that this doesn't exist, which also relates to the next point, which is shooting the messenger. Some people, when they're involved in projects, might come up with hey, there's going to be a problem, 6 months from now once we implement this project, and then that person is the naysayer. Going back to that, the handbrake conversation, they're considered that negative business prevention unit, as opposed to trying to protect the long-term outcomes of the business, and ultimately disconnected then from that operational risk profile. So some of the key fixes here are embracing culture of risk awareness, allowing people to speak up, developing that challenge culture, again, enabling them to be able to say that something is going to change in the future without feeling like they're going to be penalized for it. Embedded directly in decision-making processes, as David covered during those strategic objectives and strategic plans, thinking about how the operational risk profile is going to change in the future should be considered upfront in those decisions. And finally, conducting those forecast risk assessments. So David, we've covered those 7 processes sort of on an individual basis and how you can improve them to focus on outcomes. Let's focus now on, I guess, broader across all of those risk processes, or any other sort of risk processes or a part of your risk framework, how we can engage people and get their buy-in.
Yeah, sure. And I guess a couple of my stories is exactly that in terms of the ICT head. How do you get engagement? You do it based on pressing their on buttons, and their on buttons are what's the outcome, what's in it for me, what's in it for my organization. And what's really critical here is the mantra that Protecht certainly uses, and all our clients do: everyone's a risk manager, every single person. The issue is a lot of them don't know it, and a lot of them don't want to be it, because they see risk management as exactly what you said, the business prevention unit, the no department, and so on. Now, the best way to engage is to move to an outcome discussion. And the key to it is stop thinking about yourself as a risk manager and think yourself as an outcome manager. Be nice to rebrand the department, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet in most organizations. But at least at a minimum, as a risk manager, think outcome management, and that's the way you approach your business, and magic will start happening. So let's go through 10 top tips for effective engagement. And firstly, we've got the, I've got the focus on aligning the two main methods we manage risk. That is the informal, which is between, I guess, the ears of people. This is how they manage their risk in their personal life, and they're experts at it, and making sure the risk system is aligned and supports it and doesn't detract from it. Michael.
So I also want to think about reframing that blocker perspective to freedom within boundaries. We haven't talked about risk appetite really in this webinar, but that's how we perceive risk appetite: is you've got all this freedom, but there are some boundaries. So focus more on that freedom element than the boundaries.
Next is making sure you engage with the stakeholders, especially the non-risk people, the frontline line one people, and ask them what are they getting out of the risk processes, and be open for a good challenge and some hard truths and fix them.
I think heavily related to that, David, is conducting risk culture surveys. Find out how they're engaging with risk, decision-making processes, how they perceive that they're being engaged across risk management.
And the linkage between risk partners or risk specialists and the business itself needs to be one of friendship, help, but tough challenge when needed, rather than being seen as the police. And therefore, the front line will go to that partner much more often, because they're going to see the value if they are talking about outcomes.
And heavily related to that is risk champions. So we see some of our customers set up risk champions in a sort of formal or semi-formal basis, where they have people in the front lines who like to engage with risk management, or have good grounding in risk management. And you either may want to enhance those or start looking at building some of these risk champions in your organization.
And one of my favorites, as Michael knows, is speak the language of your frontline staff who you are engaging with. Risk managers love to come up with big words, acronyms, and all the things to make themselves sound smart, yet they are not engaging the front line. That will not get engagement.
Now, as I've kind of walked through in several examples already, show how any tool use that you want to have your people use leads to those specific outcomes. Again, keeping, what is in it for them is really the purpose of that.
And very importantly, reward smart risk taking. And the best way to describe this in my mind is, if one of your staff fails, but they fail taking risk within your accepted risk appetite, and they do not fail deliberately or negligently, you should actually reward them, because you should expect them to be using risk for reward. And sometimes it doesn't quite work. As long as they're within the governance structure and the limitations and the boundaries, you should support them.
And finally, use tools to enable efficiency. As I mentioned earlier, efficiency itself is one benefit, but that efficiency can also drive effectiveness and better engagement with those tools. So David, let's bring it all together now with how we can think about some of the reporting from an overall enterprise perspective, not just those individual processes that we've covered.
Certainly. And think about then when we look at these objectives of reporting, that it's all about objectives. So we need to be able to, through our reporting, give assurance to management, board, so on and so forth, regarding the achievement of our objectives. If those reports are coming up as green, it's saying we are going to achieve our objectives, and it may be that it might push management to take a little bit more risk to even get better outcomes. Everything is good. Equally though, red flags is saying that there is a lot of traffic on the road and we might not get to the concert on time. Therefore, you need to respond to that red flag and maybe make a different decision. And lastly, risk-based performance assessment, that when we think about what we're doing as a business, we're balancing risk and reward, and the balance between risk and reward is our performance, risk-based performance assessment. Now, before I hand over to Michael to look a little bit more in depth in bringing it together, what's really important here is to ensure that you are recording and managing your strategic and operational objectives within your GRC system. Here's an example here where we are linking our objectives to all the risks that Michael's been talking about. And very importantly, top left corner, we have the reward metrics. How well are we performing, primarily using our KPIs? And the next one on the right are our risk metrics in relation to how our risks are tracking. The right becomes the left unless it is managed. Michael, what do you typically see the balance between these two?
Well, here I'm not particularly happy. I wouldn't be happy with these. So we've got not a lot of good reward. We're not performing very well. 2/3 is, outside of, or not to where we expect, as well as, risk is, there's a little bit of red, but, a lot of stuff that's sort of heading outside. So I think there's a little bit of work to do here in this organization. Now, it might be that because both of those are extended, that maybe we need to do a bit of right sizing. Potentially on, are we, do we need to bring some of our expectations, down a little bit potentially? And there are, of course, some other alternatives depending on, whether some of these are all green or red. But we'll focus more on the next dashboard that I'd like to cover as well, David, is risk in motion, which where we take the risks that we aggregate across those different processes. We covered some of these processes before, our risk controls, attestations. So we can look at all of that in concert. How do we bring all of those together and orchestrate them in a way that provides some of these insights? And the thing that stood out to me when I looked at this particular dashboard is that we've got insurance risk that someone has assessed as being a low current rating, but 7 out of the 11 CROs are outside of tolerance. So to me, that says there's a problem here that we need to focus on. Is that risk really low? Is it evolving? Do we need to do a reassessment and focus some more activity in this particular area? David, when you brought up the the processes before, one of the rings had some specializations in it, and one of those was business continuity or operational resilience. And there's the traditional risk profile, but then there's also how do we make sure our organization is sustainable to major disruption? So we looked at, a range of operations before and thinking about the traditional risk profile, but how do we think about these severe but plausible disruptions as well? And this particular dashboard tells me that business loans needs improvement, which, we've already assessed it at that rating, but we can identify why does it need improvement? Well, we've got some of our underlying resources, whether it's technology or people, that isn't going to be recovered in a sufficient amount of time. We've also got some scenarios or exercises that have been held that haven't, passed the expectations. We may not have met the tolerance levels that we set. The thing that stands out most for me is that we've got no open actions here. So if I was, an executive or a board looking at this high-level dashboard, I'd be asking questions. What are we doing about business loans? How are we making sure that that is resilient moving forward? So, David, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We've framed up why we have this perception problem, what outcome focus is. We've covered some of the key processes and how you can drive a bit more purpose within them. And we've brought together how you can engage your people and then bring it all together. So what is a key conclusion or takeaway that you'd like to share with the audience?
Mine's very simple, and that is think outcome management, don't think risk management. Managing risk as a means to an end, it's not the end in itself.
David, mine's very similar, and it is everything starts with outcomes. If you don't start with outcomes in mind, then you don't have those, or objectives in mind, then you don't have those outcomes driving the risk processes and what you need to do there. So a couple of final things before we head off today. You can head on over to our website to look at how Protecht ERM, our GRC platform, can help you, particularly bridging objectives and risk. In the middle there, you can watch a longer demo that highlights our strategy and objectives process. And if you're looking for more engagement with your people around these outcomes, we also have a risk management fundamentals for everyone short course as part of our academy. Now, we'd love for you to stay on the line for another 30 seconds or so just to answer an end of webinar survey. Helps us understand what you want, what you like, and how we can help delivering awesome webinars for you in the future. So thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, David. As always,
Thank you.
love presenting with you. Any final thoughts from you?
No, that's fine, and appreciate everybody's time that they give it up. Hopefully it was worth it and we achieved one of your outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you.